You
Yeah.
know, Scott, I was in Ukraine a couple of times in the last couple of years. Last time I was there, it was around May 9th. It was on May 2nd, that, to be with the people in Odessa who were the family members of the people that were killed by the Nazis at the House of Trade Unions. And in Ukraine, they stopped celebrating Victory Day. It's no longer celebrated, but it is celebrated by the people. They come out anyway, and they're intimidated by the Nazis when they do, and they continue to come out. And just a couple of other things on what you said. You know, Bandera has been named a hero of the country in Ukraine. That's the status he is right now. And I want to say one other thing about Ukraine. And one of the leaders of the massacre you mentioned in Kiev, where 33,000 Jews were killed while the Nazis was there, was allowed into the United States after World War II. And right up near where I live and near where you live, about an hour south of Albany, he started a camp, which is a summer camp for Ukrainians. And they have statues there of what they call the heroes, including Bandera's statues and the other collaborators. And they meet there once a year. They wear the uniforms of the Nazi collaborators of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, and they celebrate some of these people. So this is going on very seriously there and also here. But I want to get on to more of the military situation that's going on right now, the humanitarian situation, talk about Bucha,
Before
and
we
the
do that,
economic situations. And I'd like to turn it over to Margaret to get into that.
well, actually, I there's so much to unpack here. And before
Yeah.
we move on to the humanitarian situation, which is really important, Scott, you've been doing a lot of good writing about the legality of this. And, one of the things that I don't hear mentioned is, leading up to, I mean, Russia started really a massive evacuation of Russian people in the Donbass region on February 18th, as the Ukraine military, the Azov battalion, started escalating their violations of the ceasefire agreement, the Minsk Accord, dramatically. And of course, that's when the Duma, I guess, passed a resolution asking to recognize Donetsk and Lugansk. And then the leaders of those regions are, asking for help. So I think that's something, if you could comment on why it became so critical on February 24th that Russia began this military intervention. But then, as well as that, more on the legitimate security concerns of Russia considering Article 4 of NATO. And so if you could talk about both of those.
Okay, well, again, in World War II, the United Nations was formed, and one of the goals of the UN was to ban war. I think the Nuremberg Military Tribunal had come to an agreement that the greatest war crime of all was a war of aggression, because from the war of aggression, all other war crimes emerge. And so the idea was, how do we stop wars of aggression? They just banned it outright, illegal. There's two exceptions to this. One is a Chapter 7 resolution passed by the Security Council of the United Nations. And that is when the Security Council determines that a situation has occurred that threatens international peace and security and the welfare of nations, that it can authorize UN member nations to use military force to rectify that situation. The most recent example of a Chapter 7 war was Operation Desert Storm back in 1990, 1991. 1991 was Desert Storm, Desert Shield was 1990, in response to Saddam Hussein's invasion and occupation of Kuwait. Again, I'm not here to say good, bad, whatever. I'm just talking about the law right now. And the law said when he invaded Kuwait, the Security Council met and said, we're authorizing the use of military force. And military force was used to achieve the liberation of Kuwait. That is a lawful war. Doesn't make it a just war, doesn't make it a good war, it's just a lawful war. The other way that force is through Article 51. Article 51 allows for legitimate self-defense. Either in terms of an individual nation or collective self-defense. And that's an important notion right now, collective self-defense. That's going to come into play. So basically, if you're attacked, you have the inherent right of self-defense. But now we come to one of the questions that emerged, and it actually comes from a period in American history, actually, 1837. There was a U.S. ship called the Caroline operating up by the Canadian border. And the Caroline was providing weapons and manpower, was smuggling weapons and material support to some Canadian rebels that were fighting the British Army. And the British Army knew that the ship was coming in, so the British Army attacked it. So the British Navy attacked the U.S. vessel, which is an act of aggression, unprovoked, they would say. But the British made the claim of the need of preemption based upon the imminent threat posed by the Caroline to the security of the British. So the concept of preemptive self-defense was born. And actually the Caroline affair, the Caroline case, is quoted to this day as one of the bedrock, the legal precedents for the doctrine of preemption. And preemption is basically if somebody's sitting there, bandaging their fist, getting their fist ready, telling you they're going to punch you, lifting weights, getting that big old arm up, and then they're ready to go. And you say, well, I'm not going to wait and just get punched. I'm going to hit them first. You preempted the attack. And that is legitimate self-defense. If there is a genuine imminent threat that can't be resolved by, for instance, going to the Security Council and asking for help. If you feel that you have to act now and a failure to act now would put you at an existential threat, you can't preempt. People have tried to use preemption. The United States tried to use this doctrine of preemption to justify the 2003 invasion of Iraq. It was all a lie. You can't preempt based on a lie. You can't manufacture a case on weapons of mass destruction and the nexus they form with al-Qaeda terrorism when there are no weapons of mass destruction and there is no nexus to al-Qaeda terrorism. So that falls apart. Now we come to Russia. Russia has articulated an Article 51 justification for its action in Ukraine. And they articulate it as a preemptive collective self-defense. Now, how can they do that? First of all, let's understand that Russia has no legal right to intervene in Ukraine if this is an internal Ukrainian dispute, meaning that so long as the Donbass was considered to be part of Ukraine, whatever the Ukrainian government is doing to the Russian speakers of Donbass is not Russia's affair. Russia can't intervene. They have no authority to intervene. They can go to the Security Council and ask for a Chapter 7 resolution to be passed, authorize intervention to resolve this, but they knew that that wasn't going to happen because Ukraine was in bed with the United States and NATO. So this is where something you spoke of is very important. The two oblasts or districts of the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, they passed resolutions earlier declaring their independence, but Russia did not recognize their independence. What they did now, or recently, in February of this year, is they petitioned. They passed their own legislation petitioning Russia to recognize them as an independent state. The Russians received that petition, considered that the petition, and then the Russian parliament granted that petition. Why is all this important? That's how constitutionally it has to proceed. So no one can say that this was just made up. No, the laws of the two oblasts, the laws of Russia were preserved. Constitutional due process was seen. It was then presented to Vladimir Putin, who signed the documents recognizing the independent status of Lugansk and Donetsk. Now what has happened overnight? They're no longer an integral part of Ukraine. And so Russia now can say this poses a threat. But then there's another problem. Wait a minute. No one recognizes them but Russia. It's not like the United Nations says, oh, well, Lugansk and Donetsk, you're part of the family. So are they protected by the United Nations Charter if they're not a member? And the answer is no, except here comes the nice little exception here, unless they're part of a collective security arrangement with a UN member. And guess who is a UN member? Russia. So Russia now has a collective security arrangement, another treaty that was signed after the recognition of independence. And this collective security arrangement now allows Russia to intercede on behalf of these security partners and resolve the security situation. Now, this only allows Russia to intervene in the Donbass, if we're talking about the law of war. Russia, however, took a look at the situation and said, well, wait a minute, if we go into the Donbass, the Ukrainians have massed between 60 and 100,000 heavily armed troops in eastern Ukraine. And we have intelligence that they're getting ready to launch an attack into the Donbass to preempt our assistance. So now if we go into the Donbass without dealing with this problem, that creates an existential threat for our security operation. We need to preempt Ukrainian assault. So now the Russians are using the doctrine of preemption as part of collective self-defense to go after the Ukrainian buildup into eastern Donetsk. But you say, well, wait a minute, Scott, but didn't they also come up from Crimea and come down towards Kiev? How does that fit in? Because now, if you're going after those people, now you have to shape the whole battlefield. And from the Russian perspective, it's not just about the 100,000 troops you're trying to pin down in the Donbass. It's about the 100,000 troops up by Kiev, about the 80,000 troops out in Western Iraq. It's about the 60,000 troops near Odessa. If you don't do anything about them, they will be able to maneuver in support of the other Ukrainians and defeat the Russian army. So now the Russians have to enlarge the scope of their preemptive attack to pin down these forces. And that's what we saw. When we saw the Russians coming in, it may look like this massive invasion of Ukraine is taking place. But the fact is, all these other things are merely supporting attacks to shape the battlefield so Russia can accomplish the primary mission of destroying 100,000 Ukrainian troops that are positioned opposite the Donbass and liberate the Donbass region. And what I just articulated right now, if I gave this presentation in law school, I would probably get a B+, but it is a cognizable articulation of a legitimate Article 51 claim under collective self-defense. The United States may try to disagree with it, but the problem with that is that the United States was part of a similar Article 51 collective self-defense argument put forward in 1999 when NATO bombed Serbia. It's the exact same thing. It was good for us then. All Russia's done is take that page, make it better, and put it out there. It's the same argument, the same case, and the same legitimacy, even more so because everything Russia has said about the threat from the Ukrainian army is true. Everything the NATO used to justify their preemption, for instance, the concept of the Serbians committing genocide against the Kosovar Albanians, was a lie. Whatever deaths were occurring is because the CIA was working with the Kosovo Liberation Army to create incidents that provoked fighting with the Serbians, which was then called genocide. It's just like the case, remember we talked about the United States invading Iraq and you can't get legitimacy off of making up a case about WMD. You can't get legitimacy about making up a case about Serbian genocide. Nothing we're talking about with the Russians is made up. The harm that was befalling the people of Donbass, the 14,000 dead, the buildup of Ukrainian military power, all of it is real, and all of it can represent an imminent threat to security that justifies preemptive self-defense in a collective security arrangement.
Remember to unmute yourself, Joe.
We've been going on for a while, so let's try to get to some other things because there's some really important issues that I think we need to discuss now. One of them is the humanitarian situation. There's been a lot of discussion in the last couple of days of what happened in Bucha, for instance, and I think we need to talk about that. What we don't hear, and I just want to also throw this in, is the humanitarian situation on the other side. What happened in Donbass, the 14,000 that have been killed, the continual bombing of residential areas, also what's been going on in Mariupol and other places. Someone put in the chat the URL for Patrick Lancaster, who's an American in Mariupol. And I just listened to one of his broadcasts today. He was just going and interviewing people, and they were saying how the Russians were their liberators, but we don't hear that here, and how the Ukrainians were shooting at them and killing them and not letting them leave the area, and it was them that was attacking them during these humanitarian corridors. And we hear of the vast numbers of people who have been leaving the country which is very interesting because it became very difficult for people to leave the country of Iraq during the Iraq War. We used to bomb them when they tried to leave. Um, and, Russians, we haven't seen bombing the cities in massive ways like Kiev, like we did with weapons of mass destruction and killed massive numbers in a very, very short period of time with Iraq. But the other aspect is there's refugees that have gone to Russia, probably over 1 million now since 2014, to escape the fighting, and we don't hear any of that. So maybe you can comment on Bucha and the humanitarian situations in general, and then get Margaret to ask some more questions.
Well, again, I know I got to be careful not to go too long because I know we're running out of time, but context is everything. In 1991, I was one of the planners and implementers of Operation Desert Storm. Operation Desert Storm was a major military operation against the Iraqis. It kicked off with I believe, a 44-day strategic air campaign. We started off that air campaign by blowing up every means of communication, meaning we shut down the radios, we shut down the TVs, we shut down everything. We blew up all the bridges, we blew up all the highways, we blew up everything. Electrical generation plants, petroleum plants, fuel, and this went on for 44 days. And we slaughtered the Iraqi people, slaughtered them. It's not a violation of the war. Everything we bombed was a legitimate military target. But the point is, we killed a lot of Iraqi civilians. Now, the reason why I bring that in is Russia engaged in a major military campaign against Ukraine. You know what they didn't do? They didn't shut down cell phone service. They didn't shut down internet connectivity. They didn't shut down the railroads. They didn't shut down the highways. They let the Ukrainian people travel to and fro here and there. They allowed the president of Ukraine to get on video conferences with the United States Congress, with British Parliament, with the European Union, with NATO, video conferences that not only elevated his status as a leader, but generated billions of dollars of military aid that then flowed in, was turned over to the Ukrainian army, and killed Russian soldiers. So the military imperative, the military necessity of shutting this down is real, but Russia didn't do it. Why? Because Russia isn't viewing this as a war like we viewed the war against the Iraqis. Russia is viewing this as a special military operation, and people make fun of that word, but it's not war, because if it was war, Ukraine would be gone today, eliminated. You wouldn't recognize it. Unfortunately, it's getting that way because the way the Ukrainians have opted to defend means they're putting their military forces in residential areas, and those areas are getting bombed and destroyed and people are dying. But the original Russian approach was a very soft approach. They didn't use Russian doctrine of overwhelming military firepower, artillery that flattens everything, followed by a massed tank attack that runs over everything. That's not what they did. They actually came in with light infantry units up front who tried to negotiate their way through the towns and cities, meet with the elected officials and say, we're not a threat. Just let us go through and do our job. We won't bother you. You can continue to govern the way you want to govern. I believe the Russians were told by their intelligence professionals that they would be well received. The rumors are that Putin has arrested several of these intelligence officials because they got it wrong. And the Russians weren't well received, and the Russians lost a lot of men up front trying to come in soft. But the point is, the Russians have never changed their position, which is they are there not to defeat the Ukrainian people, but to defeat Nazis, to demilitarize, and to bring minimal harm. And we have written orders to this effect. Now, unfortunately, there's been fighting, and we see, there are civilian casualties and there are refugees. That is just one of the horrific realities of war, which is why the United Nations sought to ban war to begin with. And everybody should ensure that the last option is always military action, that we exhaust every venue short of war before we go to war, because war is horrible. War is awful. You don't want to glamorize war. You don't want to legitimize war, but it's happening right now. And we need to understand that the Russians have done everything humanly possible to minimize the damage that's been done to the Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. We see the Russian concern when you talked about it, Joe, about how before the war started, they began the evacuation of civilian populations out of the war zone, which is one of the things you are required to do under the international humanitarian law. That if you are going to wage conflict in an area where there are civilian structures, you have a duty and responsibility to get the civilians the hell out of there before the fighting starts. Because if you don't, then you're using them as de facto human shields. Well, guess who hasn't evacuated the civilians? The Ukrainians. And now we come to the opposite end. The Russians have gone out of their way to treat Ukrainian civilians with respect. What have we learned about the Ukrainian nationalists, the Nazis? They view anybody who collaborates with the Russians, any one of these mayors who said, yeah, come on in, keep going, we're not going to harass you. They are now collaborators who will be killed, and they are being killed. They're being arrested and assassinated by the Ukrainian government for the crime of collaboration. They're doing the same thing with people who receive Russian humanitarian aid. The Russians hand out these aid packets that are in little green boxes. They have a white star. You may have seen them. They say Voyamtorg military store, but they hand them out their dry rations, and they give them to people who are hungry, who are starving. It is a crime to possess one of these. If you possess one of these and the Ukrainian National Police catch you, you are treated as a collaborator and you are killed. And this becomes important when we start talking about Bucha in a minute. But as this war goes on, too, we're seeing another thing, the displacement of people. People tend to run away from combat zones because most people are rational thinking people and they don't want to be around where shells are going off. So they flee, and they try to flee out of the combat zone, which means now millions of people are fleeing into Europe, into Poland, into Hungary, into Slovakia, into Romania, Moldova. They're fleeing there, and this creates a crisis of its own. And you talked about Article 4. You know, one of the big things about NATO, people talk about collective defense. An attack against one is an attack against all. That's Article 5. It can only be invoked once, right after 9/11, and pretty much what was a propaganda show by the United States to show that the world was lined up behind it. They flew some airplanes over the United States for airborne warning, as if the terrorists were going to hijack even more aircraft, and they sailed some ships in the Mediterranean, but it wasn't real. But NATO's been at war many times. The other article that authorized NATO to go to war is Article 4, and that's basically where the members can consult with one another on matters of imminent security concern of one or more members. They've used that excuse to take on Serbia, to go into Libya, to go into Iraq after the invasion, to go into Afghanistan. And today they've convened Article 4. Poland and the Baltic nations have convened an Article 4 consultation, and they're talking about what can we do in Ukraine. NATO recognizes that if they send military troops into Ukraine, they lose Article 5 protection. So meaning that if Russia responds, you can't gin up the whole NATO group under Article 5, but you can gin them up under Article 4. And that's the danger. Right now, there's active discussions in NATO about creating a humanitarian buffer in Western Ukraine so that these refugees don't come into Europe proper. They're held in place in Western Ukraine, but they need to be protected, so NATO troops will come in. Initially, people said, well, that's insane, because if you do that, the Russians are going to attack, and now we find ourselves where two nuclear-armed opponents are facing off against each other at a time when they're both talking about using nuclear weapons. So there's been a lot of hesitation about getting people involved. But as this war progresses, and I believe it's going to get far worse before it gets better, there's going to be even more humanitarian pressure on Europe in the form of this wave of refugees, and there will be more pressure on Europe to do something about it, to include putting a buffer zone in that could lead to force-on-force conflict with Russians. But now we come to Bucha. Bucha was occupied by the Russians. The Russians, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Russia's been perfect. My experience in the military is no military is perfect, because it's composed of human beings who are subjected to some of the most horrific things in the world. Man killing man, or woman killing man, whatever. Human killing a human in a combat situation is murder. It's organized murder of the worst sort, and it's not easy to do. It's not something, and it's good that it's not easy to do, but when you get into a combat mode, and I speak of personal experience, You dehumanize the enemy because you go insane if you viewed them as human beings. So you dehumanize them to the point that you can kill them without thinking, without remorse. And if the second you lose that edge, you die, because the other guy hasn't. He's going to kill you. And when you get that way, you need discipline and you need leadership to be watching your men and women very closely to make sure they don't go over the edge. And it's tough. I mean, Michael Hare wrote a book called Dispatches about Vietnam. It's a classic book. It was quoted in Apocalypse Now, but the saying was, charging someone with murder in wartime is like writing speeding tickets at the Indianapolis 500. It just doesn't make sense because war is about murder. Well, it's not. It's about murder of other combatants. It's not about murder of civilians. Sometimes civilians die. That's just the horrible reality of it. The modern military math is, generally speaking, in a modern conflict, for every combatant that dies, a civilian dies. So if we're in a war where 100,000 soldiers have died on both sides, you're probably going to have 100,000 dead civilians. That's just the way it works. But not in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the numbers are much higher for combatants killed than civilians killed. The number's still big for civilians, but the ratio is not 1-to-1. The ratio is like 7-to-1. 7 combatants for every single civilian killed. Why? Because the Russians are coming in soft. Even when most of the civilians are dying because the Ukrainians are digging into civilian neighborhoods, forcing the Russians to blow up buildings, put down artillery barrages, etc., killing civilians. But the numbers would be even lower if Ukrainians obeyed the law of war. The reason why I bring this up is we're talking about mindset. We have one side that says we're trying to preserve human life, and civilian infrastructure. We have the other side that says if you collaborate with the Russians, you will be killed. I mean, it's written down. They've made videos. They talk about it. So now the Russians are in Bucha to withdraw, part of this withdrawal. While they were there for several weeks, the Russian military says we had good relations with the local people. It was peaceful. We traded our dry rations for their dairy products. So they had a system of barter set up. So the citizens of Bucha would give them eggs, milk, cheese, and the Russians would give them the dry rations, the flour, the salt, the sugar, the meat, etc. And this was going on. Then the Russians left. Anybody who engaged in that kind of interaction with the Russians was now viewed as a collaborator. We know this because the Ukrainian National Police have published an announcement that they are going into Bucha on April 1st to carry out a cleansing operation to liquidate the collaborators. All right, this is the exact opposite of the Russian approach, which is we treat everybody with respect and we try not to harm civilians. The Ukrainians are saying, if you cooperate with the Russians, you will die. They have a videotape of a senior political figure announcing on social media to the citizens of Bucha, stay in your homes. The National Police are carrying out a cleansing operation. Do not panic. Stay in your home. She repeats it over and over and over again. Why? Because the police are in the streets gunning people down, kicking in doors of people who are collaborating and killing them. And we know this is more than just a document and a videotape, because a videotape of lady speak, because we have videotape of them actually doing it. We have videotape of the Ukrainian police, especially an Azov group, proudly claiming that they're going on a safari. That's an important word, because when we talk about propaganda, how you take the language of one side, flip it, and use it again, take your language, flip it, and use it against the other guys. It's the Ukrainians who have a special unit. The name of the Ukrainian Special Police Unit that went into Bucha was the Safari Unit. And they were carrying out a safari to cleanse the pro-Russian collaborators. And cleansing means kill, not capture, kill. And they're doing it. And then they go around and they film the dead bodies and they say the Russians did it. Now, there's a couple of things about the dead bodies. One, most of them are wearing white armbands, which means that they were telling the Russians, we're on your side. Don't shoot us. All right. 2, near each body is a green dry ration box, which they were carrying when they got killed, and it's on the ground next to them. 3, when they didn't have the armband, it's because the armband had been taken off and used to bind their hands behind their back. These people were murdered, not by the Russians, but by the Ukrainians. And yet that's not the spin that we're getting right now. The spin we're getting is just the opposite. All the forensic data that's available right now strongly suggests that the Ukrainians are responsible for the death of these people in Bucha. There's no doubt about it. The other interesting thing is they're trying to say these bodies died. I don't want to get too graphic here, but I've been around dead bodies. All right. You shoot a body on March 19th and you leave it lying in the street in 50 and 60-degree weather until April 2nd, the body ain't looking like they're looking on TV. Bodies tend to bloat up. The clothing tends to tear because the body swells, and then the body bursts, and it's very disgusting. It's gross. It's fetid. It's putrid. It's not what you saw on TV. What you saw on TV were freshly killed human beings. And we have another piece of evidence that more people need to pay attention to. A Mexican journalist gained access to Bucha on the same day that the Ukrainians were declaring this, and he filmed the bodies. Fresh blood. He sat there and said, these people are freshly killed. This is fresh blood. Body ain't laying there since March 19th. It has fresh blood. These people were murdered on April 1st by the Ukrainian National Police. And yet we have the President of the United States coming out and saying that this is a war crime perpetrated by the Russians and Vladimir Putin needs to be brought to justice in The Hague. This is a propaganda war unlike anything we've seen in modern times, because it's not just about manufacturing a case for war. This is about an outright lie about murder, which makes us complicit in the crime, us being Americans, because that's our president who's facilitating the crime.